Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for another CERN-SEED talk. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. Just a few reminders for those who are joining us via Zoom. Kindly mute your microphone when you're not speaking. And during the presentation, we invite you to write comments and questions in the chat box, and also to let us know if you cannot see or hear something. I will be monitoring the chat, and we will have time for questions and brief discussion at the end of our guests' presentations. I'd like to begin also by introducing myself as one of the co-moderators for today's session. My name is Eto Villafranca. I am currently an academic engagement manager at the University of Melbourne Museums, particularly focusing on the Science Gallery in Melbourne. My research focus is situated at the intersection of learning spaces, in particular teaching and pedagogy and deep learning. I'll pass on the floor to my co-moderator, Reden.
Hi everyone, good afternoon and good evening to those who are here in Japanese room. My name is Reden Rasho, and I have been a research fellow here at the University of Melbourne, working on issues around urban informality, urban governance, planning, and disaster issues in different parts of South and Southeast Asia. So today's activity is co-organized, as Ethel already mentioned, by two networks, organizations. One is called SEED, or the Space for Engagement and Epistemic Diversity. SEED is a safe forum for sharing research, anything research really, by emerging as well as early careers researchers or academics, graduate students, with focus on scholarship from marginalized places. And some of our fellows have been studying the spatial politics of uneven geographies of both North and South context. Some of them are also looking at issues of indigenous, racial, sexual, and gender communities in different parts of the globe. In fact, currently SEED has over 80 international fellows based in 28 countries across Latin America and North America. So we have become truly global this year. The other co-organizer is called another network called CERN, or Cities and Environments Research Network. CERN is a collective of Filipino scholars based in both Australia and the Philippines. Some are actually alumni of, or most are alumni of Australian universities. Our members study issues at the junctures of urbanization, disasters, development, informality, urban governance, learning environments, and climate change issues, among others. So welcome everyone to this activity, and I'm delighted to be introducing two wonderful scholars. We're going to talk about the notion of island urbanism. So the exact title is Post-Urban Rural Frontiers, Examining Diverse Island Urbanisms. We're so lucky to be hosting Aireen and Andre. Let me first introduce Andre, who obtained his PhD in geography from the University of Washington in Seattle. Andre is currently an assistant professor at Syracuse University. So he flew all the way from the United States just to be with us. Andre is a human geographer and critical demographer who's passionate about social justice. His interests lie at the intersection of urban, population, and community geographies. In particular, he examines the spatial politics of urbanization in the cities of the Global South, interlinking urban transformations with transnational mobilities of migrants, capital, and ideas, and interrogating the multiple spatial configurations of accumulation by dispossession. So I've been following Andre's work and citing some of his articles over the last few years. Then, of course, we have Aireen as well with us, who's currently a PhD candidate at Macquarie University. She's also a research fellow. She's a proud SEED fellow and also a fellow of the Center of Global Urbanism in Ural Federal University in Russia. So she lived in Russia for, I think, 5 years. Yeah. Her research pays attention to children's urban spaces and the importance of children as co-creators of spatial knowledge. In her recent grant, she analyzes the urban imaginaries of slum-dwelling communities in the Philippines. Aireen's recent publications include Examining Vital Cities, Slum Soundscapes, Coastal Cities, Winter Cities, Southeast Asian Cities, and Urban Nightlife. So you could see that their interests really intersect, but also there are unique issues that they also individually touch on. So today, Aireen and Andre are going to speak for about 50 minutes to probably 1 hour. Then we'll have a SEED fellow and also CERN member who's going to respond, share some of her insights. Ethel will introduce Pam later. After that response, we'll open the floor to questions and discussion. Let me now pass on the floor to Aireen and Andre.
So thank you all for being here today. Let us first acknowledge that the institution that Aireen represents occupies the lands of the Darug Nation, and she respects elders past, present, and future, and sort of recognizing the continuity of knowledge that nurtures country and community. I, on the other hand, work on an institution that occupies the lands of Onondaga Nation, who are the firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee. So Aireen and I are delighted to present our work entitled Post-Urban Frontiers, Examining Diverse Island Urbanisms in the Philippines, which brings up both theoretical and empirical significance of island urbanism, which for us is a topic that is often, we argue, oftentimes overlooked in urban studies. Our project aims to highlight islands as critical and dynamic sites of urban knowledge production that challenges traditional urban-rural binary.
So traditionally, thank you. Traditionally, urban studies have been framed or have framed urban and rural areas as distinct and separate entities. And however, this binary framework overlooks the multifaceted realities of island urbanism and the significance of gender in shaping urban dynamics. And islands are located in a liminal space in urban theory that we argue offer a unique socio-spatial entry point in emphasizing dynamics that go beyond rural-urban dynamics. And here we push for island urbanism in unison with post-colonial provocations in urban studies, where we acknowledge the need for multiple narratives of urbanization beyond the usual suspects of global cities. And in particular, we hope to pay attention to smaller island spaces. And so for this presentation, we use a gender lens to challenge the urban-rural binary and recognize the fluid and interconnected nature of spaces, situatedness of urbanization, particularly the micro spaces and intimate dynamics that underpin the production of urban spaces. And more specifically, we explore 2 case studies: gender dynamics of transnational island urbanism, it's Andre's case, and island memories of women baby boomers, my case, and also the oceanic imaginaries of children in the Philippines.
Well, before we venture into the empirical details of our case studies, let us first raise some important points in charting the theoretical landscape of our project. So like what we mentioned earlier, we situate our work within a sort of a broader call raised by scholars in urban studies who are putting this post-colonial provocation from the likes of Ananya Roy, Jennifer Robinson, Helga Leitner, and Eric Shepard, where the argument is that they wanted to expand the geography of urban theory to include multiple spaces and terrains, and sort of underscore what Helga Leitner and Eric Shepard would call as the ecosystems of possibilities in urban theory. As we look at different case studies, hopefully we can develop multiple theoretical vantage points and sort of have
Like
theoretical debates.
multiplicity
Yeah,
of
multiple
vantage, yeah.
narratives and stuff. So from this, we consider island urbanism that we're trying to proffer to everyone as some kind of a conceptual vector, which Ananya Roy mentioned in one of her earlier pieces, which we consider as a concept that travels and interlinks diverse expressions of urbanizations in various islands. In a way, we want to contribute in bridging island studies and urban studies as we try to analyze and frame urban transformations in various islands and coastal regions across the global south. And we hope that theorizing urbanization from island settings can provide some conceptual insights beyond urban-rural dichotomy or typical diffusionist narratives. All right. So, for example, there have been several efforts by island urbans or scholars who talk about urbanization in islands from notions of blue urbanism, which highlights the role of the ocean in sustaining or supporting urban spaces. Also, scholars have talked about tropical urbanisms, from which tropical islands become sites of urbanization. Scholars have brought up the notion of have raised the role of tourism in particular in shaping island dynamics or urban dynamics, or the rise of blue economies in tourism islands, or Patrick Nunn's notion of thin spaces, for example. That's another conceptual sort of offering. Island urbanism can also help us shift our focus from a land-based urban narrative to the notion of coastal cities or sea cities, which helps us to emphasize the relationality and interconnectedness of urban spaces, which we argue destabilizes the dominant narratives based on the fixity of urban and rural binary. And lastly, for this particular presentation, we wanted to invoke feminist provocations in urban studies as we try to account for the embodiment of urbanisms in islands. In here, we try to emphasize relationality, fluidity, and interconnectedness of migration, encounters, and ideas that produce sort of the everyday urban spaces in islands. So in particular, especially for my paper, I seek to uncover what feminist geographer Isabel Dyke would call as the hidden spaces of placemaking in the practice of everyday life. And in here, we uncover the everyday complexities of local and global relations as these islands experience this accelerated transnational and local interconnectedness, which sort of bring together issues of gender, sexuality, and how that becomes a grounded framework for urban transformation. And for us, by focusing on the everyday, we try to capture this complexity of the local and the global relations as all these interconnectedness become much more fast-paced and accelerated. So for our first case study site, this is for next slide, we explore islands in the Philippines that have become bustling tourist centers teeming with resorts, restaurants, internet cafes, and other enterprises. In a way, these islands have become reliant on tourism, attracting to foreigners. A big chunk of this is drawn from a paper that was published last year in Urban Studies that talked about bodies of transnational island urbanism. So for our next slide. So let me start by providing a background for this research. In the Philippines, several island communities have been transformed into world-class tourism hubs over the last few decades, formerly reliant on fishing. Many of these islands are now teeming with resorts, restaurants, internet cafes, and other enterprises that cater to foreign tourists who have come in throngs. I consider these islands to be terrains that have been long neglected by urban theory, and I argue that much can be learned from this transnationally oriented form of urbanization, where change is not just due to metropolitan expansion or industrialization or spurred by state-led development programs. Instead, in these islands, development relies on tourism, which facilitates a cumulative causation of economic activities, demographic change, and transnational connections. But a closer examination suggests that at the heart of these urban transformations are the intimate geographies of gendered bodies and interracial marriages, which serve as key modes of urban accumulation and transnational mobilities. As we all know, many of our islands in the Philippines are major components of the country's tourism campaigns. So for this research, I am interested in the ways in which the Philippines have attempted to build some kind of silver economy. They have, the Philippines has a Philippine Retirement Agency. And in a way, this building of a silver economy is grounded upon this demographic change all over the world, which is graying. So you have a graying population in various parts of the world, mainly in the global north. Through the Philippine Retirement Agency, they've established a special retirement visa, which has been created for foreigners. It used to be 35 years old, which I don't know if it's still 35. So I'm definitely in that age group. But so you only need to deposit a certain amount of money.
Especially if you're a millionaire.
Yeah. I think, yeah. All right. Sorry. So one of the multiple discourses from which the campaign is built upon is this problematic narrative, which you've encountered in different, spaces. This historical promotion of the submissive Filipina to foreigners, oftentimes perceived to, and these foreigners are oftentimes characterized as Caucasian men from the global north, or some would call AFAM. So across blog sites, dating websites, and message boards for expats and foreigners. Now you have YouTube channels that promote, that's very like masculinist and creates this whole narrative. They tend to seek to relocate to the Philippines and other global south countries. And in a way, the prospect of acquiring special retirement visas in the Philippines are typically associated with finding, meeting, or living with Filipino partners. Such tendency can be illustrated by, typical I got this several years ago. This is an illustration of how sort of the narrative is based upon the notion of the Filipina as one of the ways of attracting retirees and tourists to the Philippines. And this image is from one of the blog sites that provide support for prospective retirees, and you can even buy how to attract Filipinos in Amazon and so on and so forth. So be careful searching for them online, or else you'll get bombarded by things in Facebook. So I made the wrong move. Anyway, so my concern as an urban geographer focuses on urban transformation occurring in the islands from which intimate transactions take place. So conceptually, I reflect on urbanization by framing these islands not just as mere biophysical entities. For me, these islands are dynamic spaces wherein intimate relations and gendered landscapes are reproduced as bodies, lands, and tourist establishments are transacted and built. Also, they are relational sites. So I guess I use this as a way of like helping me think about this relationality. Hello. They are relational sites that are embedded in these transnational networks of economic, cultural, and social relations, not just with national capitals, which I connected the islands with the national capital or regional cities, but they're all also tied to other parts of the world. And this attempt can be seen in this illustration in this slide, where you have islands in certain parts of the Philippines that are connected to other parts of the Philippines and transnationally. For this presentation, my aim is to trace these transnational geographies of island urbanization through experiences of women in an attempt to foreground the role of gender and sexuality in narratives of urbanization. And my claim is that interracial relationships involving Filipinas are key to understanding urban transformation in many of these islands, which are marketed as tourist hubs. And my third objective is to theorize island urbanism, which is in unison with Aireen's objective as well. So for both of us, by focusing on islands, we aim to continue efforts in theorizing an extended urbanization that goes beyond cities. And many of these islands are not necessarily considered cities. And lastly, my fourth aim is for this talk is to explore possible research trajectories emanating from this provisional work. Before I get into the meat of this presentation, I do want to say that this research topic emerged out of 3 previous research projects that examined urban transformation, where I interviewed expats with their Filipino partners. I made follow-up interviews, one through Zoom, and visits to some islands in Southern Tagalog, Visayas, Northern Mindanao. And I got embroiled in all these murky interactions with couples, because I was also in an interracial relationship back then. And in a way, these interviews are complemented by secondary data collection drawn from different relevant government sites and visits to expat message boards, blog sites, and dating sites. Unfortunately, I do have to say that COVID has impacted this research project. So I've only done Zoom interviews during COVID, but I've never gone back to the islands. So I will return. So I think it is critical to start with the theoretical impulses that underpin this work. While I engage with several bodies of literature, I mainly engage with efforts to theorize urbanization beyond cities. No worries. Very good. I think it should be in the next slide. All right, so while I engage in different bodies of literature, I mainly engage with efforts to theorize urbanization beyond cities, where I emphasize transnational urbanism. In theorizing island urbanization, I draw from the notion of what I would call as dialectics, which was proposed by this Barbadian poet and academic Kamal Brathwaite. This notion of dialectics potentially frames the complex and shifting entanglements between sea and land, the diaspora, indigeneity, and routes and roots. And for me, this helps me get into this methodological entry point to theorize island urbanization beyond metropolitan-centric or diffusionist narratives of urbanization. And I like what I mentioned earlier, we attend to feminist provocations in geography, particularly the hidden spaces of placemaking. All right, so given that that tourism is a key mode of urban transformation in these islands. I engage with existing tourism literature that has mainly focused on marketing these islands to the global market. Historically, the Philippine government has emphasized tourism as a way forward for these islands, particularly in the Visayas. As you can see in the slide, this is an old document from the super regions plan of then President Macapagal Arroyo, wherein the tourism department conceptualized Central Philippines as the tourism super region, wherein the task at hand was to create direct international access, seamless interconnectivity, and the creation of world-class tourist facilities. And this political and economic desire to create the necessary infrastructure has provided the necessary conditions to facilitate urban transformation in these islands. So in the next few slides, I will present to you narratives of Filipinas and their partners, where I try to weave a partial geography of island urbanization. These are provisional, but are instructive to understanding the relationality of island urbanization. I group these narratives between two common threads in my interviews. One is the notion of suerte or luck, and the sawing palad, or the malas, or the unlucky women. So these narratives of women help me think about the sort of the urban framing of these islands, how in the ways in which they are intertwined. So the first narratives pertain to those who are maswerte, or lucky to have a good spouse. And this brings us to John, who is a 60-plus-year-old retired Canadian from Saskatchewan. John, who met his Filipino wife more than 2 decades ago in a resort in the Visayas. John considered her as the bedrock of their family and their business. And the wife is Marissa, who is a 40-plus-year-old Filipina from Cebu. And their narrative demonstrates this mode of urban accumulation. So since foreigners cannot own property in the Philippines, Marissa was instrumental in the purchase of beach properties in a small coastal town in central Philippines. Through Marissa, that's not her, of course, but this was a cartoon. John was able to finance and establish the town's first tourist resort, catering mostly to foreign tourists and mixed-race couples from the US and Canada. And Marissa has taken over most of the operations of the resort and has conducted most of the financial and legal transactions, even engaging with politicians and other landowners in the island. And then another Filipina experiences of a supposed successful Filipina is Maria. Maria considers herself to be lucky because she has a generous husband who's been understanding, and both of them have been successful in a sense, in an economic sense. Maria is a 40-plus-year-old Filipina who grew up in Bicol and who initially connected with her husband online. After getting married, they established one of the first resorts in an island in central Philippines, which is now considered to be one of the most highly rated resorts in TripAdvisor in the area. And because of this, Maria was able to support her family back in the province. She was able to finance the education of her siblings, and she was able to provide jobs to her relatives by employing them in the resort. In fact, they have marketed the resort to foreigners for its supposedly attractive girls. So they are already attracting other girls in other parts of the Philippines. And what emerges from these narratives is a particular geography connecting islands. This geography is constituted by flows of capital, care, investments, and relations. What I will interrogate these, I will focus on these two island spaces, the tourist hub and the hometown. First is the tourist hub, interracial. So in the tourist hub, for the tourist hub, interracial marriages enable the flow of substantial capital as investments, which fund the conversion of lands into tourist resorts. Several of these resorts, due to the husband's nationality, have had a captive market, primarily tourists from the husband's home country. So you'll find like German-themed resorts frequented by tourists from these countries. It is from these resorts where spaces of encounter emerge between tourists and Filipinos who work or provide services for the resort. Foreigners cannot own land in the Philippines, therefore Filipinos would, some would say they become fronts in land purchases and other formal business transactions. And given the popularity of these sites, they have instantiated this cumulative causation of investments from other interracial couples. And these are also sites in these tourist hubs from which relationships are forged. Given the rise of these tourist hubs in recent years, in a way, I asked if this is reflected in the increasing patterns of Filipinos marrying foreign partners, where a significant sizable chunk are females. According to the Commission on Filipino Overseas, 50% of these marriages are referrals through relatives or friends, while 24% are through the internet. And you can see here an overwhelming percentage of those who are married to foreign nationals are females. And this brings us to the second space, which are the hometown of Filipino wives. So from tourist hubs, we go to their hometowns, usually in other islands. Through personal referrals and an emerging network, narratives of hometown transformation indicate the role of networking through interracial marriages. In one coastal town, for example, in the Visayas, of course, I wouldn't mention the name, the whole village has significantly seen a transformation due to marriages with foreigners. These can be seen with the rise of concrete bungalows or two-story mansions and the emergence of businesses, several of which are internet cafes. Given this palpable impact of interracial marriages, internet cafes and other services have been put up to continue this lucrative relationship. And there are also narratives, sadly, which has emerged in some kind of cottage industry that borders around issues on mail order brides and even online prostitution. So this brings us to the second narrative, the sawing palad, the unfortunate. So interracial relationships, while glorified for some, are also embedded in problematic power relations and historically embedded racialization of bodies and desires. In these narratives, I'll share, these are like failed relationships, which are grounded upon paranoia, which tends to underpin these kinds of engagement. This paranoia is tied to racialized stereotypes of bodies, the rich white man, the affam or the submissive brown woman, or the Filipino gold digger. Let me take you to an island in the central Philippines, one of the promising tourist spots in the country. I met and got to know a couple, an American and Filipina, for a couple of months, 7 years ago. The American guy, who is a former American soldier, has traveled in various Asian countries and met his Filipina girlfriend in one of the tourist resorts. But our conversations have been fraught with paranoia about Filipinos in the Philippines and his fear of being a milking cow of his girlfriend's family. For him, he does not want to invest in the Philippines and honestly does not see his future with his girlfriend. And now we go to the girlfriend, Anna, and I got caught in this whole interconnection. She came to the island from a smaller town in one of the islands, but she's been subjected to verbal abuse from her boyfriend, who had become very stingy when it comes to money and demanded full disclosure of everything. Despite this, her family from her island pressures her to regularly send money back home, and she is pressured to basically, go up the social ladder and to build her career. But because of all these pressures, she could not continue her education. And on top of this, she has been catcalled several times in the island by neighbors, and she would even be called as prostitute, or the bad word pok in Filipino. So this presentation underscores the importance of looking at the role of gender race and sexuality in urbanization at the heart of urban transformation in islands. As I look into islands as sites of urbanization, it is of utmost importance to return to the theoretical drawing board that brings into fore the role of bodies and sexuality and gender, which are forces in urbanization. So with that, let's go to Ireen's case study.
Thank you, Andre, for that wonderful presentation. Oh, I'm presenting. So yeah, I will present two, but nevertheless interrelated urban contexts. One is from the memories of the elderly, based on this paper in a Q3 journal in Russia, not as the Q1 journal of Andre, and the other is from the imaginations of children. The first case study is based on a paper that only tangentially touches urbanization, but it has some resonance with the development of port and seaside market. So the first case is the case of Virac. It is a municipality in the island province of Catanduanes in Bicol. And for a long time, Virac had the only port in the island of Catanduanes, making it the center of trade and travel point in the island. And during World War II, the waterfront in Virac was filled with passengers and cargo ships. And right after World War II, the former ships of the US military dominated the Philippine shipping industry. So the narratives that couch Virac and its region suggests distinct privileging of the masculine constructs of strength and rationalism to represent ports. So so we call Virac, people from Virac, Viracnons. So, and I was able to interview baby boomers in Virac, thanks to my mother, who just passed away last April. So this is also dedicated to her. So to my mother, wherever you are, high five. So I'm going to present two parts. And the first one is about the macho port, and the next one is about the empowered women. And I will share about the case in Virac urbanization, that while the port is can be seen as a macho, with a macho narrative or a macho lens, because of the masculine visibility of all those muscles, there is a stronger feminine force that is behind it. So the participants memories in the part. So I did some memory work with senior citizens, so they're like 60 and above, and for them the body is something that serves as a relevant aspect of gendered inclusions and exclusions in seaports. And the gendered space of the maritime industry has always been visible to the boomers growing up. So when my mother was growing up, they can see different men in the port. And according to them, the port community, like the port laborers, the retailers, ship crew, embrace a narrative of the port as a masculine space to the physically demanding nature of port activities, such as carrying or doing certain things, pulling certain things, or pushing. So for example, big bodies, with muscles, or people sometimes call those people with abs like practical abs, because those abs were built due to like work, not in just in the gym and protein shake or whatever. So they are associated with power because of their ability to carry huge and heavy shipping equipments. And based on the bodily structures and voice presence of muscled men in the port, the boomer as girls, now they are grandmothers, but when they were girls, they were able to construct their version of what they call macho. So the dominance of muscular male bodies saturated the sidescapes of the port, playing the central roles in the port's imagery. And these men were either ship manual workers or cargador, or the ones whose primary role was to carry ship items. And then there are men in uniforms, and they receive a different attention. And the ship captain and his uniformed crew receive more reverence and respect because they're with uniform. And the women islanders, they are the constant they are the constant subjects of admirations of the women islanders. So as one boomer says, I fantasize. So again, this is a grandmother recollecting, or yeah, this is a 63-year-old recollecting fantasy. So I fantasize about muscular bodies in my early puberty, especially when I see crews. I compare them to skeleton or skeleton or very thin boys in school. And I have to admit, I judged them, the skeleton boys, and thought that they rose from the dead. I was drawn to older men because of my sea crew crushes. So yeah, but in all these, there is a strong feminine force that is at play. And we call them like the Oragon women. Oragon roughly translates to a strong and confident fighter. For those who are from Bicol, correct me if I'm wrong, and we can engage into different dialogues about it. And so here, there's a different narrative in the marketplace. So that's the part now, it's the marketplace. The femininity assumed in female bodies might seem imperceptible to the glamorized hugeness of visible masculinity in ports. However, while the female body can be a subject of weakness, it is also a position of power of economic development. And the participants themselves, the baby boomers, recognize the role of women in the seaside market, which are integral parts of the everyday transactions and survival of the market and creation of infrastructure. Specifically, women were leaders in the market informalities, in the seaside, in which there is something related to intellectual sources. So these women are intellectual sources. And 6 of my participants have mothers who work in the port, including food retail, microcredit, and marine-based craftworks. And as one participant said, men have macho bodies, but my mother has a macho brain in seafood retail. So this person said, I guess many people did not realize that being in the seaside market requires not only physical strength, but also intelligence and strategy development, and at times compassion. So the participants remember the seaside markets as the territory of women's intellect, and whereas the coastal markets narrative operates in the logic of business deals and transactions, very rational, the feminine informal economy in Virac were sources of emotional support and knowledge and sound advice in the market. For example, one big role of women played in the seaside market was having informal microcredit businesses. And my grandmother is one who can be called as a loaner. And instead of turning to big loan sharks for borrowing money, local people in Virac preferred informal credit businesses run by women, not only for lower interest rates, but also for financial literacy, because big credit businesses had been predatory and exploitative and never lenient in deadlines for borrowers. In contrast, my grandmother, for example, as a woman microcreditor, she provided an opportunity for people, for fisher folks, to access small loans with reasonable interests. And as one participant said, as a loaner, my mother never profited from others' hardships and miseries. She could have easily milked out cash from them, but she chose not to. So not only did the local people benefited from access to alternative loaning schemes, they also accessed financial knowledge, albeit informal, through women loan providers. And although small-scale women in informal microcredit businesses gave free financial advice and information to local people in Virac, So women loaners shared necessary tips to save money, for example, or prepare for children's education, or be financially stable in old age. And moreover, women in the seaside market were skilled bargainers and negotiators. So they have skills that overshadow the physical abilities in the macho port. So the participants recall that as young girls, they have seen and felt how trusted women were by fisher folks in terms of monetary dialogues in seafood retail. And women seafood retailers were dependable for having fair pricing, and they did not haggle for lower prices compared to bigger businesses that push local fisher folks to sell their catches for cheaper amounts. And so as one participant said, my father was a fisherman, and manay, it's a general term for an older woman, has always helped him in finding other buyers, and she has never taken advantage of my father, especially when his catches were not at the best. So women in fish retail it also prioritized small fishermen as suppliers over big companies, and they even help fisher folks to contact local diners and eateries so that they can compete against big fishing companies in supplying catches to diners. And through word of mouth, women retailers gave positive testimonies to hook up local fisher folks with diners and even restaurants suppliers of the dish. So what can we see from all of these? So what can we see from all of these? It shows the dynamic that while the port transformation can be seen with a macho narrative because of masculine visibility, there is a stronger feminine force within it. And while the ocean and ships may overshadow the assumed femininity of female bodies, women play significant roles in the seaside markets, and they are leaders in the market informalities, providing intellectual sources and displaying qualities of intelligence, strategy development, and compassion. And these women are skilled negotiators and bargainers that fisher folks trusted. And such dynamics underscore the gendered nature of island urbanization in seaports and seaside markets, and they illustrate how gendered inclusions and exclusions are reflected in the memories and perceptions and roles of individuals within these spaces. And this reveals the resilience and power of women in seaside markets. And the next one that I'm going to present very quickly, because I needed to include children, is about children's imaginations about a city on an island. So this is more of a lighter view. So picture this: a fictional city not born from the minds of urban planners or scholars like us, but from the boundless creativity of slum-dwelling children in the Philippines. So to provide a brief overview, the research involved 15 slum-dwelling children who were 9 to 12 years old, and they actively participated in an on-site world-building activity. That's the coolest part of my PhD thesis, by the way. So they created 4 fictional cities in groups of 3 or 4, and the aim was to prioritize the engagement of children as active participants in urban discourse, challenging the traditional adult-centric knowledge production methods. And today I am sharing one of these 4 cities, the fictional city of Masaya, or in English, what's Masaya? Happy, yes, created by 4 children. So let me bring you to Masaya. So Masaya City is situated on an island. It embodies the residents' focus on clean water as a central element of their urban life. And so this is the fictional city of Masaya. There is, it includes a public space near the estuary, old houses, fences, and fishers' cottages that provide spaces for cooking and rest. And one of the most intriguing aspects of Masaya City is the presence of 2 schools with little teachers and big teachers. Little Yeah, little teachers and big teachers. So schools with the school with little teachers consists of insects like bees, butterflies, dragonflies, caterpillar. They said that a snail is an insect. Of course, I disagreed, but yeah, they said snails are included because they are small. So offering perspectives from the smallest inhabitants of the city. And then the school with big teachers includes dragons and elephants and lions and giraffes, providing insights from the largest city dwellers. So this their aim there is for the students to learn what it is like to have a small body or a big body, just like marine creatures. So recognizing the importance of protecting the sea, Masaya City established a pirate academy and to train the Bantay Dagat crew or the Coast Guards who serve as dedicated Coast Guards. So this emphasizes the city's commitment to safeguarding the coastal environment and educating new recruits about their duties and responsibilities. Of particular interest is Where the Water Goes office, and by its name, it manages where the water goes. So this office is composed of kind humans. That's the merit that they want to employ someone in this office. You need to be kind, both humans and non-humans, that act as the committee that decides how the water is used in the city, including distribution and quantity and price. And adjacent to the Where the Water Goes office is a pink powder manufacturing house managed
Pink
by
powder.
fairies. It is managed by fairies. So this house produced pink detergent powder from mushrooms. I don't know why mushrooms, which plays a vital role in cleaning the sea and the river. So that's like produced by fairies, thus protecting the health and well-being of the water-based city dwellers. And then there's a time-telling church that serves as a symbolic reminder for residents to pray for a healthy ocean. And it has a Catholic influence because of in the Philippines, majority is Catholic. So its bell rings every evening at 6 p.m., prompting everyone to come together and offer their prayers and reinforce their commitment to the well-being of the city. And so what can we learn from this? First, there is a critical imaginary of the environment with water as a living space. And oceanic imaginaries of children reflect the profound importance of water as a central space of urbanity. And this is, this is in contrast to the land-based understanding of urbanization. And the residents' focus on the clean water highlights the significance of this resource in their urban existence. The second, Masaya City embodies the principles of blue urbanism, as Andrew has mentioned earlier, emphasizing the sustainable urban water resource management and the establishment of the Where the Water Goes office, for instance, and the pink powder manufacturing house managed by fairies exemplifies the city's commitment to responsible usage of water and the marine environment. And the third, Masaya City recognizes and embraces the multi-species nature of its urban environment, the existence of schools with little teachers and big teachers, for instance, as well as the estuary public space, showcases the city's intention to foster interactions among diverse inhabitants and promote a harmonious coexistence of various species. So understanding the knowledge from the critters allows for a nuanced perception of how space is utilized and distributed, and as well as its functions and limitations. And this reveals the multi-layered negotiations and contestations among coexisting bodies to gain space in the city. So let us be reminded, however, that the imaginative features of Masaya City shed light on the complexities and limitations of land-based experiences in relation to the ocean. So these children that I had a world building workshop with, they are land-based. So their oceanic imaginaries are also different and probably very, very different from fishing communities. And this implies to decenter the land-based perspective and open up possibilities for oceanic, more than human approaches to looking at urbanism. And this drives me to the point that it is essential to also acknowledge children as as active contributors of oceanic imaginaries and it's fine. Oceanic imaginaries and bluescapes and water environments. And the oceanic imaginaries of children. The oceanic imaginaries created by children offer valuable insights on how young members of society relate the ocean and the broader environmental challenges that they face, and by actively engaging children as co-creators and valuing their perspectives, we can challenge the traditional adult-centric approach to urbanization and knowledge production about the ocean. And the imaginaries and vision of children reflects the resistance to being subjugated by single vision of ocean urbanism, island urbanism, and this resonates with the works of Andre, lots of even geographers who see creativity as something that we can use to further understand urbanism.
So our our efforts, Irene and I's efforts are basically works in progress in terms of provoking urban theory. For us, this is an attempt to sort of reimagine the urban-rural binary towards some kind of a post-urban-rural frontier perspective. So understanding island transformation goes beyond a physical and economic change from the so-called rural to the so-called urban. Rather, for us, we wanted to emphasize the relationality involving various elements at play, such as gender. The processes of island transformation challenge the notion of a linear urban to rural fixed label, and instead, it invites us to consider the fluid and hybrid nature of urban-rural spaces. And for us, by recognizing the gender dimensions of island urbanism, allows us to expand our understanding of urban political contestations involving children as well. And it helps us envision alternative pathways for urban development. So we further argue that islands possess unique spatial characteristics, cultural complexities, and distinct patterns of urbanization that offer alternative pathways for understanding urban political subjectivities. We forward the need to recognize and understand also the persistence of rural dimensions like the sea or water, the coast, and in a way, the practices, the persistence of rural dimensions in the practices in peri-urban areas in island settings, rather than viewing islands solely as traditional zones on their way to becoming fully urbanized. And for us, islands are not just peripheral or isolated, but they are actually integral sites of urban development, as we have hopefully we're sort of demonstrated in our case studies, particularly with the ways in which they have their unique dynamics and complexities. And for us, by foregrounding gender lens in examining island dynamics, we can broaden our understanding of and children, understanding of urban political contestations, and to reconceptualize how islands have been framed within urban studies.
And so, to conclude, our research on diverse island urbanisms in the Philippines shed light on the complexity of urban-rural interface, and adopting a gendered lens and also children's perspectives in examining diverse island urbanisms in the Philippines challenges the prevailing urban-rural binary, as Andre said, and promotes the concept of post-urban and rural frontiers. And by acknowledging this interplay, we can uncover the power structures, exclusions, and inequalities within island urbanism, and this recognition paves the way for more inclusive and equitable urban futures where there are different factors that play as as with different roles in shaping urban knowledge production. And we hope that new avenues open for understanding rural-urban interface, and we urge for the need to integrate islands and waters into urban knowledge production.
And lastly, before we end, we would like to mention that this presentation is situated within our effort to push for island urbanism as a concept and as a mode of creating a network of scholars from islands to talk about urban transformation occurring in smaller islands in the global south. We see island urbanism as a lens that can disrupt traditional sub-regional divisions, Southeast Asia, East Asia. And instead, we hope to connect new urbanizing spaces across islands in various sub-regions, from the Pacific to the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean. And for us, as we try to confront sustainability challenges as well, theorizing and working with island context can potentially provide lessons on how to grapple with building a sustainable world that is both environmentally sustainable and socially just. With that, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So with like 1, 2, 3.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Stop sharing. All right. Before we open up the floor for questions and discussion, we would like to invite our colleague from CERN-SEED, Pam, to provide a 8 to 10 minute response. But before she does that, I'd like to introduce her. Pamela Cajilig is a design anthropologist with 2 decades of experience in qualitative research and consulting for such fields as women's rights, participatory design, and strategic communications in the Philippines, Thailand, and Kuala Lumpur. She recently obtained her PhD from the Humanitarian Architecture Research Bureau of the RMIT University School of Architecture and Urban Design. Her doctoral research, Designer Citizens in a Modern Human World, Participation as Inhabitation in Post-Disaster Reconstruction, is an ecological examination of the processes through which inhabitants of small island rebuild after and amidst catastrophe, given limited access to material resources and political capital. Pam?
Thank you so much, Ethel, and congrats to Andre and Irene for two such thought-provoking presentations. I'm so glad that the concept of island urbanism is being raised in this forum. My own research is situated in a Manila Bay island fisherfolk community, and in engaging urban planners, for example, in the conditions of my field site, I was a bit frustrated because when I would tell them about the conditions in the island, it's a small island, heavily populated, very dense housing, but an island situation. I was once told that, this shouldn't be a dilemma. Just call your site, just label your site as a peri-urban site, which I feel doesn't really capture the movements and life on the island, which I feel island urbanism is really able to speak to. So I suppose I'll speak a little bit more about my positionality, because even though I identify as being a feminist and a women's rights advocate, my academic work doesn't necessarily engage these themes. My academic work is more on disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. So in listening to the 2 presentations, I was trying to look for connections within my work. So I think for the most part, I will emphasize these connections and then raise a few questions for further discussion to the authors. So, to summarize, the two presentations challenge the urban-rural binary by also by showing us different inflections of gender in the different uh, island communities and through the lenses of the different interlocutors of the presenters. So on one hand, we have Andre's focus on tourism, and then we have the focus on seaports with Eileen. So one thing that clearly resonates with my work here is that we really cannot essentialize islands, nor urbanism, nor gender. The two presentations really show the different island conditions that lead to different constructions of gender, and also which result to different ways of urbanism unfolding in these two islands. I think for my own work, what I'm taking off from here is, I work in, as mentioned, I work in disaster risk reduction and adaptation, where there is a tendency, especially in adaptation, to have typologies in terms of how climate risks should be responded to in coastal areas. And I think just the idea that it's difficult to essentialize islands and urbanism must also mean that we also must challenge these typologies, retreat, adaptation, accommodation, as strategies to address disaster risk, because we also need to understand the specific social relations that underpin these risks. Secondly is the burdens placed on women, whether actually, as in the case of Irene, or metaphorically, as in the case of Andre, right? So even in my own field site, women are at the forefront of climate adaptation and disaster management. They are also fisher folk, so they, similar to what Irene has brought up, many of these women contribute to financial management. In fact, one quote from my own field site, from one of my interlocutors, I think captures this. They said, a man's job is easy. All they need to do is work. But whether the income from that work is sufficient to raise a family or manage a household, that's the problem of the woman. So they have to be the ones to understand how to stretch the budget and look for ways, whether it's borrowing money or managing the household finances or looking for extra sources of income, to be able to augment their income. But a lot of this work, as we all know, is undervalued, is not recognized, and is not considered as work. Or it can be subject to derogatory comments, as in the case of women who are married to retirees. And it's the same for children, as Irene brought up. They can contribute to reimagining better futures. They can contribute to managing risks, but that capacity is also not acknowledged. And the third theme I'll bring up is the impact of transnational structures on urbanism and island life. I think this was more pronounced in Andre's presentation. But of course, even if Irene didn't mention this specifically, when she talks about coastal vulnerability, that of course is exacerbated by climate hazards that have to do with lifestyles in the West, excessive and extractive activities that are driven by governments and corporations. Um, and so I'll move now to my three questions, which I two questions actually, which I like to pose to Andre and Irene. Is one is, I understand that your work is a work in progress, and I was just wondering whether there is space to go beyond the gender binary of men and women in your future work, so that we can nuance islands and urbanisms and gender uh, even more deeply. And second is, and this is a question that I also ask myself frequently when I frame my work as work that is related to islands, is how significant is the term island to our analysis, because a lot of the conditions that you mentioned, urbanization, coastal risks, apply to communities that are not necessarily islands, but they share the same risks. So I guess this is a question for all three of us: is when does the term island become significant, and why should it be significant? Why should their experiences be bracketed from other areas that are experiencing similar situations, that are also being exoticized to attract retirees, or are also fisherfolk communities? So yeah, I'll end my commentary there.
I'll pass on the floor to Andre and Irene to respond.
Let's collab.
Thank you very much, Pam, for your insights and questions and queries. Really appreciate your comments and questions. So the first question is about
Gender. Beyond gender.
beyond
The
gender.
binary of
The
male,
bi-
female, gender.
yeah. I mean, it's something to explore in terms of like queer
Free
spaces.
spaces.
Um,
We are
Which-
actually, I am toying around the concept of seeing again spaces as queer, as not necessarily in terms of like the binary, because what we want is to actually is again break the binary, such as rural, urban, or women, men. Of course there is space. It's just that perhaps our in our cases the respondents were women, and so we were, and they highlighted women's struggles and also contributions, which is why we ended up with this these kinds of analysis. But of course we are considering different ways on how to frame different kinds of resistance against different sorts of binary. So definitely there is space. And Andre, would you like to?
Sorry, I get
Yeah.
distracted from my face. um,
Andre needs a moment.
I would say that I guess I can talk about gender and sexuality as an important lens for me in understanding urbanization in islands. Whether it's reproduction of the binary or queering. In particular with tourism, like tourist spots and tourist spaces, and how these islands have been transformed because of these reasons that are tied to forging of relationships, and I think it will. I mean, I will still continue pursuing that. So that's tied to the first question. But the second question is on islands, the importance of
Yeah.
islandness. Do you have a response to that? But I'm thinking of the ways in which, since my work has been tied to, so my interest on tourism sites is because I see clearly how these sites have experienced radical transformation because of the islandness of it, the lure of the beach,
Concept, yeah.
the ways in which you need to project a nice island vibe to attract tourists. So the islandness is sort of essential to continue the inflow of capital, the inflow of tourists into these spaces, which demonstrates the contradictions of capital. We have all these accumulation happening and destruction of the environment, but you need to maintain that environment to continue the inflow of tourists. So at least in my case study, that's how I see the concept of islands as an important part in the production of urban spaces in these contexts.
And also, like for my respondents, the island is important because of like their identity, because they have always said that we are island girls, taga-isla, or yeah, taga-isla ako. So I think island is important, not necessarily because of the space, because yeah, you're right. They have the same consequences. They face the same struggles, such as coastal cities, in terms of disasters. I think islandness is important in my case study because of the identity that we are from islands, and we have this kind of identity, taga-isla kami. So it is how island is important. But I'm also like, that is a very important question,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
someone told me, so I'm not sure if you're familiar with Lisa Law. I'm actually she's the head and founder of Tropical Urbanism in James Cook University. And then I was also trying to like recruit her to the Urban Island collectives. And then she said, oh yeah, what do you think? Is Australia an island? Because well, technically can be, but then we're thinking about the Pacific, like Fiji or Tuvalu or Vanuatu, and even in Southeast Asia. So thank you for opening up that question, because obviously we're answering from the vantage points of our research, like the lure of the island and the island identity, but it opens up for a broader dialogue on what an island really is and how important it is. So that's why we need to collab, because we need to see the importance of islandness.
And I mean, talking about technicality, we go beyond the physicality. It's really the imagined geography of islands as a mode of, at least in my case, I tend to look at the sort of the urban transformation happening, and then how islandness is such an integral
Because of
part.
the island
Because of the island
concept, yeah.
concept.
And me because of the identity,
Yeah,
so of Isla.
yeah.
I'll
And that
just
also-
maybe respond one more time to that. I think that's a really important point that you brought up: identity, and imagination. And I just thought about how hypocritical the government can be in mobilizing this identity. So when or not mobilizing it. So when it works in favor of market-driven projects, then there's full promotion of island identities. But when it comes, for example, to disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, where a lot of adaptation plans, to minimize risk, quote unquote, of fisher folk, they move them inland. And so when they argue that you cannot move us inland because being part of an island, being close to sea is so part of our identity, suddenly it's not an issue anymore. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
thanks, Pam, and of
Thank
course
you.
our two presenters. Fascinating presentations, insights from the thesis you presented. We're supposed to have another responder, colleague from Indonesia, because Indonesia is also an archipelago, Roro, but she can't make it. I think there's a conflict in her schedule. So we would now proceed to open discussion. So guys, if you have questions or you want to share insights, we'll collect insights first from people in the room. So,
Go ahead, Erica.
okay, so we'll probably collect two before we hear from Andre and Aireen. Erica, then check.
Hi, yeah, so this is also the sort of a response as well. First of all, thank you for that very insightful discussion. And it definitely, just to also like Pam position my own research, my current PhD project is it's a creative writing project on eco-fiction, but my focus is on the relationality of Filipino time and the very loadedness of the idea of the tropics, I mean, how that is deployed in narrative. So yeah, which is why I resonated so much with your response when you were talking about is Australian island or what islandness in island urbanism is. Really resonated with that precisely because that is how I think about how tropicality is deployed in our narratives as well. So I see the discussion on both of your discussions on island urbanisms as already a very important lens that I've seen in other works that I've seen so far. I don't know if you've encountered Chaya Ocampo's work before. She has this paper on how Waray women survivors of Yolanda deploy the identity of the strength of Waray women in order to help them survive post disaster Yolanda. It's there's so much richness that could be gleaned from like a very gendered intervention into the discussion of urbanism. So it's really just want to say that it's really fascinating for me to see, because especially because tropical narratives around tropicality and Filipino women and islands are so wedded together and also lumped together in this very othered space, both in the Philippines and internationally as well. So I'm just looking forward to seeing what else springs from that from island from that framing of island urbanism. So I hope you get to pursue that. And maybe in terms of that question about is Australian island, maybe at least the way that I see it, qualifying island as tropical island, for me, I think that sort of encapsulates what it is you're talking about with the kind of with the island imaginary that you were talking about. So I feel like that's where the intersection of island urbanism and tropical urbanism is for me. It's the tropical island that occupies that and that other space. So I don't know if that's something that
It's like an element of exoticization.
that the exoticization and that goes all the way back to the Spaniards writing about tropicality in the Philippines. So maybe is that something that that perhaps intersects with what they were thinking about, like qualifying it the island urbanism as tropical island.
Yeah.
Thanks, Erica. So we'll hear from Chet afterwards.
Super excited by your presentation. I could see the joy of it as well when you were presenting. I love the idea of island urbanism because that's related quite closely to what I was thinking of doing. And I was thinking of, because I'm from Fiji, and while when you were talking about island urbanism, it sort of gave me that log that I was looking for when I was doing my research, because a lot of the post-colonial provocations that you were talking about, it made sense because the way that cities are being designed, it's not the same as metropolitan countries like Australia. And you might be of interest to going to Tuvalu once in a while as well, because their whole land is like really small. You could walk around.
Yeah.
And then how do you define boundaries of urbanization there?
Yeah, exactly.
So I was pretty excited when I just had one question. In one of the resort managers case that you were presenting of the tourism workers, and the ladies took on the role of the resort manager, I was wondering why they weren't classified as directors. Why, were they given equality on that, or?
Director of the.
So you know how the Filipino women are able to purchase land, and husbands are the resort owners, but they're given the title of a resort manager, but not the resort director.
Oh,
Which is a kind of a higher position. Yeah.
well, that's an interesting. Well, for the cases that I encountered, this is not like a big resort. It's really a family-owned resort, and but the owner is the husband,
Husband.
and
So there's like a.
yeah, there's a power. It still reproduced that sort of dynamic power, gendered power dynamic between the two, the financier and the one who manages the affairs. You know, really performing the double burden of having to take care of the family, transnational stuff, and doing the business. And I do appreciate the fact that you mentioned about Fiji and other Pacific islands, because it's in the urban literature and even post-colonial urban studies. Like where like if you want to think about theoretically, like where do you draw from? You always draw from big mega cities in the global south, but which does not resonate to islands which are transforming, experiencing vestiges of urbanization. And I think these are veritable. And for us, we're motivated by giving space for the islands as veritable sites for urbanization, that you can theorize from these islands, because they are, you know, I mean, in fact, we will learn a lot about urban sustainability and
Even the sustainable development goals, they're quite like Western focused. And so when you try and translate some of those goals, like Suba is doing at the moment with its voluntary local review, you can see like a clash while there's a push. And then you're like, well, how do you localize something that has been forgetting some of the main elements of it? So it was nice to see some of the council members come in and talk about their identities to land. So that social relations was very important. It's not only about the developments and the structures. People actually have that social relations, even with urban spaces. And I remember there was a tree in the city center of Suba, and it was supposed to be cut down, but the traditional owners would come and say, this has been like a very heritage site. It has been a tree there since forever, and they had to develop around it. So, you know, things like that, in terms of the symbolic values that people have towards the spaces that starts to develop and grow.
Right, yeah. And just a response to Erica, thank you for bringing that up, like the concept of tropical. And yeah, because they're like, for example, islands in the UK, and do we consider that as an urban island? And also I remember National Geographic explorer Sandra Turner, who's writing about islands. She has this wonderful description of an islander, and she said an islander is an island is something that is surrounded by water, and the whole earth is actually surrounded by water, so we are all islanders. So it's just nice to reimagine islands in so many different ways. Perhaps there's not just one definition of islands. Maybe there are many different definitions of islands, many different ways of how to reimagine islands, and maybe think of island as a process, island urbanism as a process rather than just defining it in a very like concrete way. So yeah, thank you for your insights as well.
and the theoretical possibilities of rethinking time and space through island temporalities can be useful as a way of confronting traditional time space, you know, the contradictions
Yeah.
of time and space.
Impression. Thanks, Andre and Irene, for the response. Jake?
So, okay, I feel the need to introduce myself since I'm really new here. I'm Arvin Jake Adolfo, and I'm currently an MPhil researcher at School of Geography. So anyway, this talk was really interesting, especially that I'm currently delving into informality. So these are binaries and these are languages. And what I resonate greatly about this topic is with regards to how we talk about islands, about woman and a man, and these are languages. And maybe we have not yet come up with a language to, you know, term the island imaginary. So I really, that's a really interesting word, like island imaginaries, because what if the island we have in mind, like the island thing, like the subject of island in this research is a different world overall. Like we have not yet come up with a word to describe the island we're talking about, because words are binaries in themselves and all. So yeah, very interesting talk. And aside from that, I really love the discursive analysis, like at the start, like images of women, for example. These also make up the image of an island, like conflating women as islands. In a way, women become island in the imaginary of the Philippines. Like as we advertise women in the islands, women also somehow become islands. So as foreigners come to the island, they don't just come for the women, but they also come for the island because somehow because of discourse, because of the image production, the advertisement, women also become the islands themselves and islands become a woman as well. So really interesting. And for, I just have one question though for Ma'am Andal.
Irene.
Were you her
Madam.
student before?
Madam.
Not
Were
you.
you
Reveal
a madam?
I've been wanting to ask this question actually when you delivered the talk on slums in the Department of Geography. So my question was, did the children really have already a preconceived notion of cities when you asked them to draw? What do you think an imaginary city? So draw an imaginary city. When you asked them to draw a city, did you consider if children really know what a city is and what a city is not? Or, and in the context here, what could be an island city and so on and so forth? So
Right. So thank you for the question. First of all, it started very differently because actually the children refused to just imagine play space, because I initially asked them, like, create some imaginations of the city of San Jose del Monte. If you can change San Jose del Monte city, a very specific city where you live, how would you change it? It is inspired by the Urban 95 movement. So it asks, if you could see the city from 95 centimeters, or the height of a healthy 3-year-old, what would you change? So it started with that. I asked them, how would you reimagine, or what are the things that, if you're going to recreate San Jose del Monte city, how would it be? And then they said, maybe we can just create our own city. Maybe we can just create our own San Jose del Monte. And so these actually are, so thank you for that. I need to clarify. These are different versions of San Jose del Monte that just went crazy. So yeah, so they have an understanding of the city based on San Jose del Monte, and then they just modified it to like different imaginations, and then one resulted in an island. And yeah, I also resonate with what you said about different imaginations of islands, because I remember, so when I was living in Russia, my roommate, who is a Bulgarian, she's not from an island, and they have a very different notion of an islander, because they called me the island girl. She's the island girl from the Philippines. And so when one time I was so anxious, I felt stressed, and then they said, so yeah, my roommate said, you're stressed? Do you feel stressed? But you're the island girl. You shouldn't feel stressed. So there's this stereotype of islanders as not stressed, relaxed. They're imagining SpongeBob, like Hawaii, something like that. So you're right. We have different imaginations of what an island is and also what islanders are. Because yeah, I personally experienced being stereotyped as the island girl who must be always relaxed.
Yeah.
So yeah.
You should always be stress-free.
Yeah, it's island.
Ethel, do we have questions from Zoom?
None from the chat. There are 2 comments congratulating our speakers for a very interesting and engaging talk. I have a question.
Me too.
In connection with the discussion about children, I'm always intrigued and I guess curious about, yes, it's great to have children involved and acknowledge that they are participants, contributors of knowledge production. But what I always was always left with the question, so what do we do then with this knowledge that children bring to the table, to
Mm.
the community,
Mm.
beyond what we as researchers or the academe do with it.
So the plan is, so here's the plan. So I want a grant, and then this grant, I am collaborating with an artist to create a book for children. So my plan is, so I have a PhD thesis. I'm converting it into a bilingual children's book about slums and about their imaginaries. And then again, because my principle is that it always if there's change, it always need if we are engaging children in conversations, if we are to include them, it always need to make sense to them. So as I have told them yesterday, so we're creating a book about how children view cities, and then we are going to distribute it to the policymakers. It will be a long, indirect process of including children, but we cannot just invite them into meetings. And so the book is a way that I can include their voices without me, because I shouldn't be there. It should be the children. And through that, if there are like policy changes, the children can say that probably part of it is them making that book, because it is them who created the book. And so that is the plan, to create a concrete output to distribute, so that, and it is something that makes sense to children. Because if I just make a report, submit it to policymakers and say, these are what the children said, and then it is still my voice, it is still my interpretation, and I am still the one to be recognized that, oh, this researcher it made the children's voices heard or something like that. And I do not want that to happen. I want the children's voices to be directly heard through a book by policymakers. I know it's a long process, it may be impractical, but I do believe that if ever there's change that children will make, it has to make sense to them. And the book is something that makes sense to them. So that's the
Thank
plan.
Thank you, and congratulations on getting a grant. I am looking forward to that. We have a comment from Dennis. Do you want to speak up, or would you rather that I read your comment?
Yeah, Dennis is also a CERN member.
Hello,
Dennis?
Wait, let me just turn on my camera. I hope it works.
Oh,
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Dennis, I'm in the Philippines right now. I am very excited to know that you discussed island urbanism in the context of geography and identity. And since I'm also in the same field with Pam, which is disaster risk reduction, but focusing on geographically isolated locations. So I'm dealing constantly with island communities, and interaction is a very important aspect of their lived experience. My curiosity is connected to how interaction is integrated into the concept of island urbanism, especially since the entire urbanism idea is threatened by, peripheralization and urban decay. So is there some ways of actually mitigating these future problems if we somehow push for the idea of the urban putting the urban concept in an island setting?
Sorry, trying to process the question.
I'm sorry, I don't brain cells left.
Sorry, Dennis.
today.
No, so you the interaction as a, how much of it is an important component of urban interaction. I guess when we think about island settings as they experience, at least in the case studies that I've gone into, in interactions in terms of migration patterns and flows of tourists are sort of also channeling notions of thin spaces. They're so fragile. They're so, I mean, these settings are small, that urban change has to be linked to interactions that are mediated, are there through mobilities of tourists and capital. At least that's how I frame it. It's very, I guess it's there. I don't know if the term should be fragile, but there are the space it can easily transform, and interactions are such an important component of these dramatic shifts. I don't know if that makes sense in thinking about how restlessly shifting these spaces are. So the restlessness, the turbulence of both the ecological and the socio-ecological transformation is linked to all these transactions and interactions. And definitely when you talk about, at least in my case studies, interactions among tourists and locals are important. Does that make sense, Dennis? I'm sorry.
Yeah, yeah. I'm very. I'm interested in that aspect because earlier in the discussion you mentioned about the identity part. Yeah, I am an islander, the island girl,
Yes.
the
Yeah.
stress-free kind of life. So if we are introducing new kinds of interaction, will it affect somehow, identity making in the future, etc., as influx of new ideas or influences are coming in, interactions with other people as well. The growth of the kind of interaction as it impacts not just the geographical location, but the identity that was mentioned earlier. So that's really the exciting part in a sense that I got in the presentation this afternoon.
It's sort of maintaining the balance really of the islandness, that identity of the island as, we're relaxed, we're not, the temporality is different. And yet you have all these tourists coming in, resorts being put up. So there's this fast-paced change. And then you're caught in that transition. How do you balance both?
Yes.
And tourists come here to experience that islandness, and yet their presence represents this shift, this rapid shift. Yeah, that's the challenge. You're right, Dennis. That's the challenge in sort of maybe sustainable urbanism, and that's why island settings can say a lot about this balancing of temporalities and change.
Thank you, Dennis. Eka,
Thank you. Thank you, Dennis.
Otherwise, I would also share some small insights.
I'll probably just want to say that Vice President, that was a very interesting presentation, and I kind of get some of these the similar kind of vibes that was also kind of happening in Indonesia. This, some sort of like transactional relationship that kind of like being used as the way to gain or transfer some capital between a lot of foreigners and Indonesia, especially in the region of Bogor, Puncak. If you know that there is, it's kind of famous of being the place for a lot of Middle Eastern expatriates.
Bogor.
Puncak.
Bogor, Puncak.
Yeah, and some other places that kind of being famous for the place for the expats from the Middle East to get some kind of like, we call it like kawin contract. Is almost like contract marriage. Some sort of that. It's being used as the way for this kind of people to gain some kind of power in the form of capital that comes in towards this kind of transactional marriage. And also like it's also kind of reflective towards how I kind of feel Bali has become. This law has
Bali,
been,
yes, of course.
you know, the way that we kind of approach the rapid urbanization funds tends to be like more and more being handled towards the necessity or the needs of these tourists rather than
Right.
the actual welfare or well-being of the locals. And then it's kind of, well, it's interesting but also worrying. How could this end up being in the future? Your research has been kind of enlightening. I'm kind of excited to see more.
Thanks, Edgar. From my end, I really like how you both have foregrounded the resources, relations, and narratives around, the notion of islands. Narratives both as projected and lived, by different actors. And this is very important, particularly in the context of the Philippines and, the planning imaginary there, which is still centered on land use. When you look at the plans in the Philippines, you still have, when I was still doing my master's at the University of the Philippines, we're already challenging the notion of comprehensive land use plan because we need to pay attention to coastal resources, to coastal relations. But if you look at the planning documents, which remain the dominant, apparatus of both national and local governments, they still look at land as the primary source. I mean, of course, land is very important, but it's in different archipelagic contexts, I think, such as the Philippines and Indonesia. It's really important to look at water, the resources around the water and the transnational relations surrounding and in a way emerging from the islands. Then, of course, Andre, when you talked about island imaginaries in relation to tourism and Aireen in relation to children's conception or imagination, they remind me of how the Philippine government is now toying with the idea of love the Philippines, which is very gendered for me. So when you show the pictures of Caucasian men and tropical women, I was thinking, is this new slogan of the Philippine Tourism Agency linked to that island imaginary or the tropical, the exoticization of the Philippines as a tropical island? And then finally, I think I really like how you started talking about, and you probably can expand later in your research, the spatial patterns and relations that emerge from the intersections of relations and resources. Thank you.
Thanks. I love Philippines.
Oh, love Philippines.
It brings up also the notion of women, Filipino women, and how they're projected in the national narrative. If we want to elevate it to the nation, how it's being used for tourism or beauty pageants.
Yes.
Or
There's a very strong commodification of Filipino women in our culture, which is kind of ironic considering that we're very, as far as the views is very patriarchal, but when you look at it, we're actually the people, the individuals making things move behind the scenes, or
Well, and then one last thing, Andre. I don't know if I just missed it, but the concept of Neil Brenner's notion of planetary urbanism, did you deliberately not? Did I miss it, or did you? What are your thoughts on island urbanism in relation to that the discourse around planetary urbanization? Sorry, that's the last bit.
no. I think it's useful. To be honest, I think planetary urbanization is useful as an entry point to connect islands as part of the urban process. For me, even if there are tensions in this narrative, I think there are productive conversations to be had theoretically in linking these narratives with the urban process, because this demonstrates how islands are part and parcel of these transformations. I'm trying to remember if one of the article that I mentioned, if I cited New Brenner, maybe not, but
Yeah, we can talk about it.
we can
later.
talk about it later.
Thanks,
Um,
Andre.
Yeah, but before I was also in touch with some of the people in the planetary urbanization in conversation with that, but I just didn't cite them.
Sorry, can I just briefly? Sorry.
Okay, sure.
No, this is speaking of like a term that you mentioned earlier. I just remember there's another Filipino scholar in Canada who also uses dialectics. Rina Garcia Chua, and she had an interesting way of deploying dialectics as well. But in relation to what you're saying about like the relationality and migration and flow, she used dialectics as a way of thinking about what she calls migrant ego-critical consciousness. And I feel like that also it might intersect a lot with island urbanisms, because it also has something to do with, as migrant Filipinos, thinking about having to rethink their relationship with their identity that's tied to land, and which goes back to the Philippines, and kind of exerting the dexterity of dialectics to rethink their identity as not bounded to specific landmass or specific area. So I just remember that because you did deploy dialectics.
Yeah. Okay, that's such an interesting like deployment of that. Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. I took note of it. Thanks. Thank you. And then connecting it to experiences in Fiji, for example, and other countries that island nations, and how migration becomes a mode of return, and what if some of these states or island states are going to be ravaged by climate change, and where do you return?
So thank you so much to everyone online and on site for a very generative and thought-provoking discussion. And of course, to our speakers who flew all the way from the US and from Queensland, but I imagine it's a bit
From
warmer.
South Wales.
I'm getting confused. New South
Because
Wales.
Queensland is some parts of Queensland are tropical or subtropical.
Good save, Redden.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us. And for those who are online, thank you for staying with us. And good night.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Oh, I can see myself.